Hello, welcome to the channel, and in this episode we're going to be looking at the death of Boromir.
Hello, Miri here. So in this section we started with Gimli telling Legolas of the 3 hairs that Galadriel gave him, and it ended with Boromir dying.
So the first scene that we just saw was Gimli reflecting on the 3 hairs that he received from Galadriel.
Yeah, that was interesting to me because he asked for 1 but got 3, so he's triply excited by that. And that corresponds with a theme in systemic philosophy about exchange and balance in systems, family systems, social systems, and other systems. And the rule of thumb is basically, if somebody does something nice to you or good for you, you return that gift with a little extra. If somebody does something bad for you, you return that badness at a little less.
Okay.
So that's the idea. There should always be a quid pro quo in relation to whatever you're given, good or bad. But when it's good, you return a little bit more.
But when it's bad, you give a little bad, but not as much bad as you should. It's not.
Yeah, so it's not an eye for
It's
an eye,
less
a tooth
than
for a
equal.
tooth.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be an eye for an eyelash or something like that.
Okay.
So I thought I'd just put that in because it corresponds to that idea that she's giving more, and with a sense that she is honouring something in him, that he will have given something, I think in terms of humility almost, in order to be worthy of that gift from her. She's in a way repaying his humility and respect, which is pretty valuable actually, although his self-worth and worth in the eyes of others is questioned a bit sometimes.
Yeah.
That for her is precisely the thing that makes him valuable in some ways. And the fact that she then returns it in triplicate, threefold, says something about her own extra generosity as well on top of that. So I thought that was worth picking up on.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting because much of what he does say seems to be, like you said, disregarded by people. Like, oh, you know.
Yeah, there's a bit of an eye roll that
Yeah.
accompanies the reaction of others. And his own self-worth is a little bit questioned. And as we get further into this scene, he's asked to go and rest by Aragorn, and he protests really and grumbles about it and says, well, you know, I'm a dwarf, we don't need to rest. As though it's a bit of a moral slight that he should need to rest, as opposed to what for Aragorn is a bit of practical common sense. You know, we're going to go into battle, make sure you're prepared.
Yeah.
The dwarf hears that as somehow a dig at his own prowess.
Yeah. We see the Fellowship on boats going past 2 huge statues. What do you think this is showing us about Middle-earth?
We see those 2 huge statues as the entranceway into this new harbour or area that we're going into. Later on, we have more statuary dispersed around the grounds. We have tombs and fallen, what look like eagles to me, perhaps, stone birds of some kind, as if we've stumbled into a lost civilization, an ancient temple. It reminded me a bit of Angkor Wat or a place like that, an abandoned or destroyed temple. And then we get this huge head, a stone head lying on its side. And there were a couple of things that made me think of, particularly in reference to the Romantic era, capital R, with its fascination for fragments. I was thinking of the Mathematical Sublime as described by Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, and also the famous poem by Percy Shelley called Ozymandias, which I think are perhaps evoked a little bit there. Anyway, the Mathematical Sublime in Kant is a category of the sublime, which is to do with effects of scale, where some things are simply too big to compute. And although we see the clear awe on the face of Merry and Pippin from the boats as they gaze up at these vast effigies, I think they are supposed to be so huge as to be unprocessable in some way. The scale is beyond comprehension. And that is supposed to evoke a sense of awe and wonder in Kant's notion of the mathematical sublime, and puts us in our place a little bit as human beings, reminds us of, well, Kant doesn't say this directly, but reminds us perhaps of a world bigger than ours, imagination greater than ours, and perhaps a divine that's beyond our ken. When that's then manifested in the form of kings, statues of kings or potentates, we are supposed to get this idea that the kings themselves, because turned into these colossal statues, themselves have king-like power, that there's a divine right of kings, and whatever a king is, it's like a pharaoh basically. It's a divine god on earth in the shape of a king in some way. But what's interesting, particularly in the Shelley poem about Ozymandias, is that even when those statues are toppled, as they are when we enter further into that sphere, we see the head fallen onto its side, the power, the kingly power, even the divine power or the pharaonic power doesn't diminish. And what Shelley hints at actually in that poem about Ozymandias, which is the name for Ramesses II, the Egyptian pharaoh, is that the power actually increases in a way, that the statue, although fallen, takes on a kind of aura that is greater than the statue would have had were it still intact and standing. There's a mystery that attaches to the fragment. And there's a whole set of theories about the notion of the fragment in romantic literature, which I think is going on here.
What's the poem about?
The poem is about a man reporting having met a traveller who has been travelling in what he calls antique lands, Egypt, places like that, who has seen this statue of Ramesses II fallen into the lone bare sands and shattered. But despite the face, the shattered visage being shattered, there is still an awe that radiates from this effigy. So it's as if you can break the thing, but you can't break the spirit. And in fact, breaking the effigy seems to release more of the spirit or the power from the thing itself. And perhaps some of that is evoked in the scene we just saw there, as well as notions perhaps of Atlantis, the lost city, which we've had a little bit earlier in the movie as well.
Anything else to say about civilizations?
Only to say that the lost civilizations are reminders that civilizations come to an end.
Yeah.
We know from the comments, among other things, about the writing of the Lord of the Rings at a period when Western civilization, quote unquote, was under grave threat. Not just Western civilization, but civilization per se, the notion of the civilized world as opposed to the barbaric world, the triumph of Nazism and anti-civilization forces in the name of a distorted civilization. So I think perhaps there's some of that going on there as well. And within the film, the idea that certain civilizations ought to be preserved. And there is that notion of respect for the past as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because we see Aragorn being really moved, being able to look at these statues. He says he's always wanted to see them.
Yeah, and in that sense, statues, although they're by definition static, have a life to them. They evoke feelings in the person looking on them, which raises a much wider question actually about how we as human beings read things in the world which are not other humans, that we can be stirred to emotion by objects, by nature, by dead things, and even by unreal things, fictions. People are stirred by the film of The Lord of the Rings, just as they're stirred by the book, The Lord of the Rings, even though there's no reality in it, and it's pure fantasy. But that's maybe beyond the scope of today's discussion.
Yeah, and there's a lot of statues and history and nature in these films.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the swords in what we saw.
Yeah, there are two moments which are quite contrasting, I think. One is in the middle of that sequence when we see Aragorn, and this is before Frodo goes off to the
Before he leaves.
for the new challenge, hold his sword up against his face. And then right at the end of that sequence, we see Aragorn return Boromir's sword to Boromir just before Boromir dies, as if cladding him for the journey into death, or equipping him for the journey into death.
Yeah.
And those two images are quite different. The first one, I think, is, to me, is very evocative of the image of the Crusaders.
Yeah.
Who were often pictured like that, with the sword held upright in front of the face. The word crusade obviously comes from the French croisade, which means cross. So these are, well, originally the Crusaders, what we call the Crusaders, were vigilantes in Jerusalem, protecting Christians from the so-called Moors, Arabs, I suppose, and Muslims in today's language. And I think that's a reference to, well, there's this, let's call it a veiled Christianity, I suppose, in this film. I know from the comments that Tolkien was a devout Catholic. There is this slight reference to the Crusader image icon there and the heroic image there. And clearly there's a sense in which Aragorn is a sort of vigilante, and they're all sorts of vigilantes, the Fellowship. So there's that. There's also, at the point where Boromir dies, this image of Aragorn doing this gesture as if he's about to cross himself, but he only does the vertical, which is interesting to me because that's another example of the semi-Christian at work. So we have the Crusader image, semi-Christian. We have the half cross. We have seen Aragorn in a previous episode visit the statue of his mother, who's very evocative of Mother Mary. So he has this Christ-like appearance anyway. So we're always reminded of him being associated with, if not representing, Christ. And I think it's important that it's an association, not a representation, because just as the film is allusive rather than being allegorical, we're invited to make a connection without being told that this represents Christ, he represents Christ, and so on. And I think that's an important subtlety throughout the film, actually. So that's the sword for Aragorn. But when Boromir dies, Aragorn then gives Boromir his sword back. Now that does a number of things. One is, as I say, that already, as it were, entombs Boromir, because that's a position he might actually die in a tomb. And if you think of medieval tombs of warriors and knights, they are often represented in stone with their swords. I was just thinking of that Philip Larkin poem, An Arundel Tomb, where he goes to visit this tomb in Sussex of a fallen knight. Actually, he thinks it's an original medieval knight and later finds out it's a 19th century neo-Gothic copy and is embarrassed about it. It's a kind of entombing of Boromir with his sword, and as such is a reminder into eternity that Boromir's true character is that of warrior. And if you think of the archetypes in this film, there's a book I read a few years ago about male archetypes, which says there are 4 male archetypes, which are warrior, magician, lover, and king. I think Boromir is always and forever going to be the warrior archetype. He may aspire at times to be king, and he's very conscious of himself being in the line of Gondor and wanting to be associated with the kingly monarchical line in some way, but he never really will be. And we know from his behavior in this sequence that he's possessed by his own demons, which means he can never be completely free of that. Whereas Aragorn can be a warrior, he can do warrior-like things, but he's more associated with at least a couple of the other archetypes. One, lover, because we've seen him with Aragorn. 2, king. Sorry, who did I say?
You said Aragorn with Aragorn.
Oh, sorry. Because we've seen him with Arwen, so he's associated with lover. So we've seen him as warrior. We've seen him as lover. Is he a king? He's a bit more princely than Boromir has been. Is he a king? Is he a magician? Up to a point, because he seems in tune, for example, with the elves and the world of magic, spiritual making, and so on. Although we've not seen him really deploy any magical tricks so far. But in terms of the archetypes, and maybe this is what makes him possibly the most rounded character of all of the characters in the movie thus far, is that he seems to be quite a well-balanced blend of all four archetypes: warrior, magician, king, and lover.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the magician, I think there's a part of him that people see in him as a magician, because he's in love with an elf. He's slightly older than he looks. He knows a lot about different cultures.
Yeah. But it serves to make Boromir look all the more one-dimensional, actually. And we see Boromir, surprisingly perhaps, in that sequence, and we'll come on to Boromir now, regress a bit, because we've seen him evolve during the movie, grow out of his slightly farouche, tempestuous set of characteristics early on in the film, where he's all up for fighting and so on. He seems to have come a bit more under the influence of Aragorn, evolved a bit, become a bit more mature, a bit more of a figure to look up to as far as Frodo is concerned. He seems to have got to a more evolved point, only for him now to completely lapse back. He's like an addict who slips back into old behaviors, and he takes on this almost rapacious quality as he tries to seize the ring from Frodo in a very unpleasant set of...
Yeah, what do you think causes that?
It's hard to say, really, because to me it seems to come a little bit out of nowhere.
It seems like it's been written that he will, like it's written in the stars type thing, like he's more of a character to test Frodo, and he's almost been used for that. I'm just thinking of Galadriel saying that he will try to take the ring from you. She's saying this will happen, and regardless of how much development Boromir does with himself, there's always a part of him, unfortunately, that will do that.
Yeah, and he doesn't just revert to type, he reverts to the worst type, which is not just warrior-like, but grotesque, almost animal-like. It's almost like the way he attacks Frodo. It's quite overwhelming and inappropriate, obviously, aggressive, certainly unwanted. I suppose as well as speaking to the notion of fate, it speaks again as a reminder of the power of the ring and the ring's power to exert this changing, transformative nature onto people. And again is contrasted with what happens to Aragorn, because when Frodo unclenches his fist to show Aragorn the ring, Aragorn has the forbearance and self-control to be able to close the hand up again and not yield to the slavish temptation that we've seen Boromir yield to. So yeah, he then, of course, in a way that's what precipitates his death, because then Boromir, once he realizes that he's crossed a line, has to atone for it in some way. And his way of atoning for it is presented to him through the attack of the Uruk-hai, where he can then willingly sacrifice himself for Frodo and the Fellowship, and thus restore a little bit of honor, make amends, and so have a noble send-off in the end. So in a way, that capitulating to the power of the ring and the assault on Frodo from a narrative plot point of view is what allows him to then sacrifice himself and die nobly.
And do you think he has a satisfying death?
For
atoning what he did?
Yes. I mean, it's good enough. He served his purpose and he expires. I mean, I think because he is the warrior archetype, in a way, he has to die. There's no other, he has to die in battle. There's no higher purpose he's ever really going to achieve, because that archetype is so firmly inscribed in him. There was always going to be a limit on his evolution anyway, I suppose. And so, in a way, it's a sort of perfect ending. It's like you live by the sword, you've died by the sword.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, if he didn't die, what would his character go on to do? And I'm not sure. I mean, like, no, because I know the movies, but knowing what happens, I don't think there is another route for him. I think
there might have been, had Aragorn died instead, because the two of them are, as it said in that closing scene, brought together in a brotherly fashion.
You mean have Aragorn die and then Boromir take on the role of Aragorn?
Yeah. Those are the only circumstances in which I could have seen more development for him.
Yeah.
But so long as Aragorn's on the scene, Boromir is a little bit surplus to requirements, and really can only exercise himself as warrior material, which is helpful and good and so on. But he always carries this risk, and he's carried a risk from early on in the film, which is that he's a bit unregulated. He's a little bit, to use a modern term, bipolar. We see him in two modes and flip between the mature mode and the immature mode, the ordered mode and the chaotic mode. So
I guess he's a soldier that's been put into a position where he has to think outside the box, and there's a lot going on, and it's too much for him.
Yeah, I agree with that. He can get so far with that before it's intolerable, which is interesting in and of itself. It's sort of saying man's character is his fate. There's the famous quote from Heraclitus, ethos anthropou daimon, which is what we're seeing there. His character is his fate. His character is warrior, so his fate is to die as a warrior in battle, which he does, thanks to the Uruk-hai. I mean, it still takes a lot to finish him off. And of course, because he's a warrior, we wouldn't expect him to fall at the first attack.
Yeah.
And, even as it's dying, he, stabs plenty of the other lot, doesn't he?
And it's the third arrow, like the three hairs.
Yeah, exactly. And the third is always death in Freud.
Yeah. In a way, it reminds me of what you said before about the Uruk-hai being kind of fodder, and Boromir's kind of fodder as well.
Yeah, he is. Having had his moment in the sun as something other than fodder.
He represents men in the Fellowship. What do you think his death or his character says about the race of men in the film?
As opposed to hobbits, you mean?
Yeah, as opposed to hobbits, elves, because in the Fellowship you've got dwarf, elf, hobbit. Aragorn is man as well, I suppose. But
yeah, that's a good question. And I suppose, well, most obviously he represents men as mortal. This is mortality, and men, insofar as they're mortal, will die and are always subject to that law, and that
and suffer,
and their gifts are limited. I mean, they have gifts, but they're not gifts of magic. For example, they're not gifts of beauty. They tend to be very earthly and caught up with competition, I suppose.
Yeah. What did you think of his speech to Aragorn, his kind of death speech? He calls him his king.
King and brother, I think.
Brother, captain and king.
Brother, captain and king. Yeah, I mean, it is a noble send-off, and it has to be, because he, like Gandalf, has done his bit for the Fellowship. He has served. He's like a firefighter or somebody who's given their life in service. And that's appropriate. Dulce et decorum est. It's sweet and proper to die for the country. It's a patriotic death. In this case, it's not the country, but the Fellowship is a sort of...
Well, it's Middle-earth.
Yes, it's a sort of patriotic band. And that speech, I think, reinforces the fact that about loyalty, really. Yeah.
Compared to the first words that he says to Aragorn and the first scene he has with Aragorn, it's a long...
Yeah, which is competitive and is a bit like an alpha male contest. This is now not confronting Aragorn, it's embracing Aragorn. And then Aragorn, of course, kisses him on the forehead, which is a sign of brotherly love and valediction. So, yeah, I think the speech captures all of those elements.
And I think what I like about that scene is that it's so different to, like, it's so tender. Like, you don't see that in a lot, like, between men.
You don't, but I mean, there is quite a lot of male tenderness throughout the film. If you think of right back at the beginning, Bilbo and Frodo, Gandalf and Frodo, even between Gandalf and Bilbo, there's a real fondness there. Merry and Pippin. I mean, although there's lots of battling and warriors, and of course we have the Nazgul and the Uruk-hai and all of that, there is a lot of virility there and old school reptilian maleness. I think there's quite a lot of friendly fondness actually between men there.
What did you think of Aragorn crying?
Yes, it's not really crying, is it? It's sort of tears come to his eyes. Yeah, I mean, to me, there's not a lot to say about that because it's in keeping with his character, which is of them. Although there's something about Frodo which isn't particularly manly, there is something about Aragorn which is slightly feminine and has been throughout, I think. Not that we necessarily associate the lachrymose with the feminine, but it speaks to a softness of emotion in him, which I think has been there from the beginning.
We see a little image of we don't see Gollum, but it's hinted that he's following them.
Yeah.
What do you think about him kind of stalking the Fellowship?
Yeah, I find that unusual because we'd sort of forgotten about Gollum a little bit. He's this weird E.T.-like, swamp-like creature at the bottom of some gloop who's spoken up, grasping for the ring at some point. I can't remember the backstory, but he had the ring for a while and then was given up or something.
No, he had the ring, and Bilbo, he lost it to Bilbo in the cave.
Lost it to Bilbo, but now he's sort of resurfaced, or not surfaced, but he's reappeared in some way as this little homunculus who seems to have an agenda that's a bit obscure. We don't quite know.
Yeah, what do you think it is?
Well, he's not really on the side of the Fellowship. Is he on the side of the Uruk-hai? Maybe. Saruman? Maybe. I mean, he seems to err slightly more on the bad than the good, but at the same time would seem to have at least a private agenda of his own, which is to reappear, be seen, perhaps obtain the ring again, as though there is another competitor or contender for it because he once had it and now wishes to restore it. Though for what purposes we don't quite know, other than perhaps dignity, because he's been in this state of suppression and disregard for so long. And there is a slight sense about him that he had not just the ring at one point that was lost, but had a stature that was lost. So I wonder if his motive, I'm just speculating here, his motive is to regain some sort of stature or recognition, either with or without the ring somehow, but without necessarily getting into bed with any of the other factions here. So we shall see.
We shall see.
But it's an interesting element of complexity in the film, which I like, because although the action is set up as goodies versus baddies, Gollum is just ever so slightly not quite associated with either camp. And I like that. And I like the kind of smallness of Gollum, that he's just this strange glitch in the system or unincorporated element that hasn't quite been woven to other bits, like a sort of like a leftover bit after you've put together a assembly pack bit of furniture. He's like the spanner left over, which I quite like about him.
The music?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about the music, because Howard Shore is the composer, isn't he? And although we've had quite a lot of the choral, stirring music throughout, we have a return, I think, of the associated with Aragorn of the what I call the Bernard Herrmann style music, which is slightly more psychological, which I really like actually, and that makes a reappearance here. Bernard Herrmann is the man who scored most of Hitchcock's films.
All right.
And I think there's a very explicit, well, it's very hard for me to not hear Bernard Herrmann in that. And then right at the end, when we see Boromir give up the ghost, just for a moment there, I thought, gosh, that chord sounds like a C minor chord to me. And as you know, after we've finished watching, we listened to the Mozart C minor Mass because I thought it was a reference to that. And it does seem to be, in the same key as if it is a direct reference to the C minor Mass, which is basically a requiem for Boromir. And I mean, I'm no musicologist, but I think the C minor chords often associated with elegy. So just worth noting that. And again, just how skillful the score is in picking these things out. And maybe it's worth saying that, if we think of Tolkien as being this highly elusive writer, referring to all of these other sources without necessarily putting them front and center, I think Howard Shore is a bit similar as a composer and then fits in a certain way. We do get, to my ears at least, we do get the references to Holst, the planets, Neptune in particular. We do get the Vaughan Williams, particularly associated with the Shire. We do, I think, get the Bernard Herrmann associated with this little bit more psychological complexity. And here we get the little bit of Mozart. So, I don't think we're supposed to say, here is a quote of Herrmann or Mozart or whatever. It's not supposed to throw us off course. But I think it is supposed to put us in a mood evoked by these moments of music. It prompts us towards a certain disposition. And I think that's skillful, actually.
Yeah, we might not be aware of it if, we might not know the names of these classical pieces, but we would have heard them, so it would trigger something while we're watching it.
Exactly. In that regard, Howard Shore's mode of composition in this score at least seems absolutely right for the way in which Tolkien seems to have worked, and Peter Jackson in turn seems to have worked, allowing all of these references to echo without being too heavy-handed about it.
Frodo, so we see Frodo really detaching himself from the Fellowship this stage. It's almost like straight out of Lothlorien. He's got his star and he's kind of really ready to leave. I mean, obviously the situation with Boromir was a big factor, but he's gone while he's about to leave.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about some of the Christian references earlier. There is that idea of Christ going out to the wilderness to be on his own before his death. I mean, I thought of that, although I'm assuming Frodo doesn't die in the end, but we shall see. And it raises the question of what the Fellowship now is, because we've had a fellowship, all for one, one for all kind of thing. In that fellowship, Frodo has been, as we were saying in a previous episode, the anointed one, but still part of the fellowship and a fellow. Now he's become of the fellowship and not of the fellowship at the same time. He is he's releasing himself, actually, as if towards a destiny. And he is being released by the others, just as Gandalf has kind of released him. Galadriel has held and released him. Now we have Aragorn sort of holding and releasing him too. So he's going through a series of, in fact, right back to Bilbo, if you think at the beginning, a similar sort of trope throughout. These characters embrace him either literally or figuratively, confer on him power and goodwill, then let him go. And it happens again and again.
Yeah.
First with Bilbo, then Gandalf, then Galadriel, now Aragorn.
Except for Sam.
Except for Sam, but I think that's not that.
Frodo tells Sam, "You can't be with. You can't help me with this one." But Sam is really trying to help.
Sam is really trying to help, which is noble. At the same time, it's a sign of fear on Sam's part of being left behind. I think there's some anxiety, separation anxiety, actually, on the part of Sam. They're of the same race too. They're hobbits, so they were bonded before. They were bonded as hobbits before they were bonded as a fellowship. So there's a double layer there. Whereas with Boromir, for example, Frodo was only bonded as a fellow in the fellowship. There was no ethnic, if that's the right word, connection. So it's going to be harder for Sam to let go because they have a hobbit bond, and then because there's a bit of neediness on the part of Sam too. It goes both ways, I think. And of course it makes no difference because Frodo is going to depart regardless. It'd be interesting to see whether Sam catches up with him at some point. I wouldn't be surprised if Sam reappears at some point and helps anyway, because he is attached.
Yeah.
But for the purposes of the drama of this sequence, it's important that we see Frodo in isolation because it adds this to the sense of vulnerability, jeopardy, and therefore drama.
Yeah.
Here he is on his own. He's still only apparently a young lad.
When Aragorn kind of sends him on his way, it's almost sending him without asking him, but then you realise that there's no other way. Because he says, I would have gone with you till the end. And when you first hear that, you think, oh, Aragorn's rejecting him. But then you realise that actually, no, it's Aragorn picked up on this as soon as he saw him.
Yeah. I think there's also just a respect for fate. It has to be like this. It's a kind of, like you were saying, it's written. It's sort of written in the stars in a way. It just has to be like this. And we must defer to that in some way. And therefore we have, I mean, I assume we're getting towards the latter parts of the movie now.
Yeah,
we have
it's pretty, we've just got like one more video after this scene.
Yeah, and I think that's important, that the fellowship has served its purpose, and now we have Frodo apparently meeting the thing, destiny, Sauron, the ring, on his own terms, which is the ultimate test, really, because unless all of these things have equipped him to deal with something by himself, what have they been for? If he's going to be dependent on the fellowship and all these other attributes and gifts and tricks, then in a way they haven't served their purpose. They only become valid if he now can survive on his own with what he's received.
Yeah, and Galadriel tells him directly to be a ring bearer is to be alone.
Yeah.
So he's been processing that since he left, probably, and now he knows it.
Time has come.
Yeah. Thank you for watching this episode, and thank you to our members. Really grateful for supporting us, and I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you in the next one.
How about this?
That's so weird.
Go on, do the same. Just do this, look up.
Okay, I'll pretend to be dead. Or maybe I'll be Boromir and you can be Aragorn, and you can kiss my forehead.
No, that's